Welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive
Wow, it's great to be back.
into modern Indian history.
Yeah.
This time, we're focusing on something pretty fascinating, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC GS1.
Absolutely. And even if you're not studying for exams,
Yeah,
this is just a really interesting part of Indian history.
it really is.
We're going to be looking at
Yeah.
socio-religious reform movements in India during the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right, these movements,
Yeah.
they really did shape the social fabric of India,
They did.
which we're still seeing the impact of today.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how these movements from way back then still have relevance today.
Yeah, and it's not just about names and dates.
Right.
It's about understanding the ideas and the people behind them.
Yeah.
And really how they changed how India thought about society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we jump into the specifics,
Yeah.
let's just quickly recap the context.
Right.
India's under British rule.
Yeah.
There are all these
A lot of changes happening.
obvious political and economic changes.
Yeah, political, economic.
But there's also this growing awareness of social injustices within Indian society itself.
Right. And that's really what's going to fuel these movements.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of British rule,
Yeah.
a society grappling with some really serious issues.
Yeah.
Where do these reform movements fit into all of this?
It's like a bunch of sparks igniting a fire for change.
I like that, a bunch of sparks.
Yeah.
What was like the first spark?
Well, one of the first and most influential was the Brahmo Samaj.
Right, the Brahmo Samaj,
Yeah.
founded in 1828
Right.
by Raja Ram Mohan Roy,
Yep.
who was like, the OG reformer.
Oh, yeah, he's a key figure.
He actually started it as the Brahmo Sabha,
Right.
which later became the Brahmo Samaj.
Yeah.
And he was really pushing for some revolutionary ideas for the time.
Yeah, really revolutionary. He was advocating for monotheism,
Wow.
rejecting idol worship, and what he saw is just empty rituals.
So he's kind of like going back to basics.
Yeah, he's saying let's strip away all the unnecessary stuff and
Mhm.
focus on the essence of spirituality.
The essence of spirituality.
Yeah.
But wait, if he was all about going back to the Vedas,
Yeah.
isn't that kind of traditional?
Right.
So how does that make him a reformer?
That's what's so interesting about him.
Okay.
He believed that true Hinduism, as reflected in the Vedas,
Yeah.
was all about human dignity and equality.
Interesting.
He used these ancient texts to actually critique the social evils of the time.
So he was saying, the Vedas don't endorse sati
Exactly.
or caste discrimination.
Right.
So why are we practicing them?
So why are we doing these things?
It's like he's using tradition
Yes.
to challenge
To
tradition.
challenge tradition.
That's pretty clever.
It is, and that's what made him so influential.
Okay.
He wasn't just talking about abstract religious ideas.
Right.
He was connecting them to real-world problems and demanding social change.
It's amazing how one person's ideas
Mm-hmm.
can really spark a whole movement.
It really is.
But I've heard that the Brahmo Samaj itself wasn't this unified front.
Right.
So what was going on there?
Like any movement, it evolved
Okay.
and even fractured over time.
So there were some internal struggles.
Yes, and Debendranath Tagore.
Debendranath Tagore.
Okay. He comes in and becomes a key leader.
Okay.
And he's pushing for things like widow remarriage,
Wow.
women's education,
Okay.
and challenging polygamy.
Which were all pretty radical ideas at the time.
They were very radical.
So even within this reform movement,
Yeah,
there were different levels of boldness.
absolutely. There's always a spectrum, right?
Always a spectrum, yeah.
Yeah, and then things get even more interesting with Keshub Chandra Sen.
Oh, here we go.
He initially starts out as a protege of Tagore,
Okay.
but he wants to take things even further.
All right, this is where it gets juicy.
Yeah.
What did Sen do that really shook things up?
He started incorporating teachings from other religions,
Whoa.
arguing for like a more universalist approach to spirituality.
So he's like, hey, let's not just learn from Hinduism, let's learn from everyone.
Exactly.
But this is 19th century India.
Yes.
I mean, that's got to cause some friction.
It caused a lot of friction.
So what happened? Did he kick him out of the Brahmo Samaj?
Not exactly, but it did lead to a split.
A split. Okay.
Yeah. Sen's more radical ideas
Okay.
resulted in two branches forming the Brahmo Samaj of India, led by Sen,
Okay.
and the Adi Brahmo Samaj, which stuck to the original principles.
So it's like a family drama playing out on the stage of social reform.
It really is. There's always drama in these movements.
So you have the moderates and the radicals within the reform movement itself.
Right. Even movements for change disagree on how that change should happen.
Right. They're grappling with different approaches and paces and interpretations.
Yeah, and how radical to be.
Yeah, this internal debate is really interesting.
It is.
But let's not forget that there were other reform movements happening in India during this time,
Oh, there were many others.
like the Prarthana Samaj.
The Prarthana Samaj, yes.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah, the Prarthana Samaj, it was established in 1867. Another really significant reform movement.
So this is happening a little bit later than the Brahmo Samaj.
Yes, a few decades later.
Okay.
And it emerges in Bombay.
Bombay.
Yeah, which is a very different environment from Calcutta, where the Brahmo Samaj started.
Right. Very different.
Very different.
I'm trying to remember, was Dr. Atma Ram Pandurang
Yes, Dr. Adi Brahmo Samaj.
who founded the Prarthana Samaj.
That's right.
Was this movement influenced by the Brahmo Samaj at all?
There's definitely a connection there.
Okay.
The Brahmo Samaj's ideas, they had this ripple effect across India.
Right. They kind of set the stage.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they influenced reformers all over.
Okay.
So while the Prarthana Samaj had its own distinct identity,
There.
it definitely drew inspiration from the Brahmo Samaj.
Okay.
Their emphasis on reason and ethical conduct.
Right. So kind of similar values.
Similar values, but manifested in slightly different ways.
Right. Because Bombay is such a different city
Exactly. Think about Bombay.
than Calcutta.
It's this bustling port city,
Right. Very cosmopolitan.
a center of trade intellectual exchange.
Mm.
So this environment likely shaped the Prarthana Samaj's approach to reform.
That's really interesting how the environment can shape these movements.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what were some of the key things
Right.
the Prarthana Samaj was focusing on?
So they also believed in one God.
Okay, so that's similar to the Brahmo Samaj.
Right. They shared that core belief,
Okay.
and they advocated for a more rational
Okay.
and ethical approach to religion.
Okay, but they didn't completely reject idol worship like the Brahmo Samaj.
They didn't outright reject it.
Okay.
They adopted, I'd say, a more pragmatic approach,
Okay.
focusing on social reforms within the existing framework of Hinduism.
So working within the system.
Yeah, more like let's reform from within.
Okay, so a bit more accommodating to existing beliefs.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Were there any particular figures in the Prarthana Samaj?
Oh, yes.
Did stand up.
So you have R.G. Bhandarkar,
Okay.
a renowned scholar.
Yeah.
He was a prominent member, and he emphasized education and critical analysis of religious texts.
Okay, so still using reason,
Very much so.
even within a religious framework.
Absolutely. And then there was Justice Mahadev Govind Ranade.
Madhav Govind Ranade.
Quite a name.
Yeah.
He was a social reformer, but also a judge.
Okay.
And he played a really pivotal role in shaping the movement's agenda.
So what were some of Ranade's key contributions?
Ranade was really interesting.
Yeah.
He believed that social reform was absolutely necessary for political and economic progress.
Okay, so he's connecting social change with the bigger picture.
Exactly. He said you can't have true national development
Yeah.
without addressing issues like caste discrimination,
Yeah.
the oppression of women,
Right.
and the lack of education.
So he's a very forward thinker for the time.
Very forward thinking.
Did the Prarthana Samaj have like a specific agenda
It did.
for social reform?
They focused on 4 key areas: intercaste marriage, interdining widow remarriage,
Okay.
and the upliftment of women and depressed classes.
Wow. So they were really trying to tackle some of the core social injustices in India.
Yeah, trying to get at the root of the problem.
So we've talked about the Brahmo Samaj.
Yes.
The Prarthana Samaj.
Right.
Were there any movements that took an even more radical approach
Absolutely there were.
to challenging the status quo?
And perhaps the most radical voice of this time was Jyotiba Phule.
Okay, Jyotiba Phule.
He founded the Satyashodhak Samaj in 1873.
The Satyashodhak Samaj in 1873.
Yeah, which translates to Truth-Seeking Society.
Truth-seeking society.
Yeah, it's a powerful name.
It is a powerful name.
And Phule was a fierce critic of the caste system.
I know he was very outspoken
He was.
about the caste system.
Yeah, what made his approach so radical was that he wanted to abolish the caste system altogether.
Wow. He didn't just want to reform it.
He wanted to get rid of it.
He wanted to abolish it.
He saw it as inherently exploitative and a major obstacle to social progress.
A major obstacle to progress.
Yeah.
So that's a very bold stance for that time.
It was a very bold stance.
What were some of the key elements
Yeah.
of Phule's philosophy?
Well, first of all, he rejected the authority of the Vedas and other Hindu scriptures,
Okay,
which were often used to justify the caste hierarchy.
right.
He argued that true religion was about equality and compassion,
Yeah.
not rigid social divisions.
So he's challenging the very foundation
Yes.
of religious authority
Exactly.
that was used to uphold these inequalities.
He's saying, let's look beyond those traditional interpretations.
Interesting. Were there any specific beliefs or practices?
So Phule drew inspiration from a figure named Raja Bali,
Raja Bali. Okay.
a mythical king,
Yeah.
known for his just and egalitarian rule.
Okay.
Phule saw Bali as a symbol of a more equitable society,
Interesting.
free from caste-based discrimination.
So he's reclaiming a figure from mythology
Yes,
to challenge the dominant narrative.
exactly. A very clever strategy.
Did Phule's movement have any specific goals or actions they took to make this happen?
Well, education was central to Phule's vision for social transformation.
Okay, so education is key.
He really believed in it, especially for women and lower castes.
Yeah.
He thought it was the key to empowering the marginalized.
Right, giving them the tools.
Yeah, giving them the tools to lift themselves up.
Did Phule face any opposition or pushback
Oh,
for
absolutely.
his pretty radical views?
His ideas were incredibly controversial.
I can imagine.
Yeah, he was challenging the very core of the Hindu social order,
Yeah,
and that did not sit well with many.
I bet.
He faced opposition from Orthodox Hindus,
Right.
but also from some within the Reform movement.
Even within the Reform movement.
Yeah, who thought he was going too far.
Wow.
Interesting, right? Even within those who want change, there's disagreement about how much change and how fast.
It's fascinating how there's always these internal debates
There always are.
about how radical to be.
But despite all that opposition, Phule's impact was undeniable.
So his ideas still resonated.
They resonated especially with those who had been marginalized and oppressed by the caste system
Right.
for centuries.
And his work really laid the groundwork for later anti-caste movements.
It did. He was a pioneer.
And leaders like B.R. Ambedkar.
Absolutely.
It's like he planted the
He
seeds
did.
for a revolution that would keep growing.
Yeah, he started something big.
So it wasn't just about Phule himself.
Right.
It was about the impact his ideas had on future generations.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about studying these movements.
Yeah.
They weren't just isolated events.
Right.
They were part of this larger historical process that
Yeah.
shaped India.
Shaped India.
Yeah.
So speaking of the larger picture, what were some of the lasting impacts of these movements?
Right.
Did they achieve their goals of creating a more just and equitable society?
That's the big question, isn't it? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
And it's important to remember that social change, it's a long and complex process.
Right? It's not like flipping a switch.
No, it's not.
These movements didn't just like erase all social evils overnight,
No, they didn't.
but they did set some changes in motion.
Yeah, they got the ball rolling.
Right.
And we're still seeing the effects of those changes today.
So they planted the seeds
Yes.
for a transformation that's still unfolding.
And that's what's so powerful about them.
So what were some of the concrete changes they brought about?
Well, for one, they raised awareness of social injustices.
Okay.
I mean, before these movements, issues like caste discrimination
Yeah.
or women's oppression, they were just seen as the way things are.
Right. Just how things were.
And these reformers, they brought these issues out into the open.
Okay.
They forced people to confront them.
So they were like the original social media activists,
I like that analogy.
sparking conversations and challenging the status quo.
Exactly.
But how did they translate that awareness
Right.
into actual change?
One key area was education.
Okay.
These movements, especially figures like Phule and René,
They were huge advocates for education, particularly for women and lower castes.
right. They believed that education was the key
They did.
to empowerment.
Absolutely. To giving people the tools to change their own lives.
Did they actually succeed in making education more accessible?
They did. Their advocacy led to all these new schools and colleges opening up,
Wow.
which created opportunities for people who had always been excluded.
That's a huge achievement.
It was a huge achievement, and it's had this ripple effect ever since.
Yeah. Generations of Indians have benefited from that.
Exactly.
What about their efforts to challenge the caste system?
Right, the caste system.
I mean, they couldn't completely dismantle it.
No, of course not. It was
Yeah.
so deeply rooted in society.
But did they make any headway?
I think they did.
Yeah, okay.
They chipped away at its legitimacy.
Okay.
They challenged the idea that it was based on scripture.
Okay.
They exposed its inherent inequalities.
Right.
And they advocated for lower castes to have more opportunities. So even if they couldn't totally get rid of it, they made it a topic of national conversation.
Exactly. They put it on the agenda.
Right. And they laid the groundwork for future movements.
They inspired people like B.R.
Ambedkar.
who would later fight for Dalit rights and help shape India's constitution?
It's like they passed the torch.
They did.
And each generation kept the fight for social justice going.
Exactly. And beyond those specific achievements, these movements had a wider impact.
On India's political and cultural landscape.
Yeah. They gave people a sense of agency.
Okay.
Like they could actually change things.
Right.
They encouraged people to question authority and demand their rights.
That's powerful.
It is.
So it's not just about specific reforms, but about a shift in consciousness.
Yes. A shift in how people thought about themselves and their place in society.
That's a powerful legacy.
And it's important to remember that these movements actually helped pave the way for India's independence.
Whoa, so these religious movements.
They were about more than just religion.
They were about politics, too.
Exactly. They were about social transformation, cultural renewal,
Right.
and eventually political liberation.
So it's all connected.
It's all connected.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the Brahmo Samaj to Phule.
A lot of ground.
And all these amazing reformers.
They were incredible.
What's the key takeaway you want listeners to think about?
I want them to remember that history isn't just about the past.
Okay.
It's about understanding the present
Yeah.
and shaping the future.
Right.
These reform movements, they weren't just events.
Okay.
They were part of a larger process of social evolution.
Right. And their ideas and their struggles.
Yes.
They still resonate with us today.
They do.
They remind us that change is possible.
Yeah.
That we can challenge injustice.
Absolutely.
And that we all have a role to play in building a better world.
That's a great way to put it.
So to all our listeners out there,
Yeah.
especially those UPSC aspirants,
Good luck with your exams.
remember that understanding these reform movements isn't just about memorizing facts and dates.
No.
It's about grasping their significance in shaping the India we live in today.
Exactly.
It's about connecting the dots.
Yeah. Connect those dots.
Between the past and the present.
And maybe even get inspired to be a reformer yourself.
Yeah.
Tackle the challenges of our own time.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into the socio-religious reform movements of 19th and 20th century India.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little inspiring.
Me too.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who might find it interesting.
And keep those deep questions coming.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those deep questions coming.